Today, I'm reacting to 4 common pieces of advice I find on YouTube, usually in the comments section, where the creatures lurk. First, we have high-intensity training for muscle building. Popularized back in the day by Arthur Jones, Mike Menser, and many others, high-intensity training aims to maximize muscle growth by doing a few heavy sets per week, with plenty of recovery time between each training day. It's not uncommon to train a muscle only once or twice a week, so as to make sure full recovery can occur between each day. The good news, this approach is effective. You can grow a muscle with as few as 3 to 5 sets per muscle per week. Taking a set to true failure also makes a set more effective. Likewise, training a muscle once a week is still enough to build muscle. However, that is where the good news ends. In fact, here is some bad news. If you wanted to maximize your muscle growth, high-intensity training is a bad idea. We consistently see more muscle growth with more volume in the research. And yes, that is in the context of participants training to failure. In fact, most studies on high volume have participants trained to failure. Even in those studies, we typically observe more muscle growth from doing more sets, all the way to 20 to 30 or even more sets per week per muscle. Similarly, although it doesn't play nearly as large of a role, training a muscle a bit more often likely grows more muscle. Finally, if recovery were such a big issue that we needed to take 2 to 5 days off after doing a couple of hard sets for a muscle, and the hit to recovery was such an issue, wouldn't these high volume studies observe worse muscle growth due to worse recovery? If you're currently following a high intensity training routine and you want better muscle growth, make the following changes. Train each muscle with at least 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle. Train each muscle at least twice a week, and don't worry about overtraining so much. If you're truly at risk of overtraining, your performance will visibly worsen workout to workout, and you'll know about it. Next, the idea that you have to get strong to get big, usually in the context of chasing a strong squat, bench, and deadlift. Let me steel man this one first. Most strong people are big. I ain't ever seen anyone squat 500 pounds for sets of multiple reps who didn't have nice legs. In fact, comparing the average 500-pound squatter to the average 200-pound squatter, the 500-pound squatter has much bigger legs. Likewise, training for strength places a big focus on progressive overload, which is an important training principle for continued progress. However, that's where my ability to steelman this claim ends. For one, getting strong, and the best way to achieve that, is demonstrably worse for building muscle. For example, a study by Schoenfeld and colleagues compared 7 sets of 3 with 3 minutes of rest in the strength training group to 3 sets of 10 with 1.5 minutes of rest between sets in the hypertrophy training group. The results? Similar muscle growth in just 1/3 of the time for the hypertrophy group. To add to that, the participants in the strength group felt much more banged up by the end of the study than the participants in the hypertrophy group. Other studies have similar findings. One study by Mattox and colleagues, for example, found muscle loss in untrained participants from just doing heavy singles. In contrast, the hypertrophy training group in that study gained muscle. Specificity is king for strength, and that's a bad thing for muscle hypertrophy. From the low number of repetitions, the focus on a few select lifts, the technique being used, the lack of exercise variation, and more. Focusing on strength too much is a surefire way to reduce hypertrophy. Can you achieve both and power build? Sure, but there will be some trade-off. So no, if you want to get big, don't focus on your strength. This isn't an excuse to not progressively overload, by the way. Keep adding weight and or reps week to week when training for muscle size. But just do it in the 5 to 50 rep range, on movements that focus on the stretch, with good technique. If you don't care about strength, you can remove the big 3 from your routine. Next, we have chasing the pump. The pump is a short-lived shift in intracellular hydration that causes muscle fibers to swell in response to physical activity, in this case, hoisting weights. The pump is a normal byproduct of lifting weights, especially for higher volumes. I've made a whole video on whether the pump is meaningful for muscle growth, but here's the long story short. Some evidence is found in association between the amount of pump experienced from training, measured via ultrasound, not through palpation by your bros, and muscle growth in the long term. However, the association is relatively modest, and it remains quite unclear to what extent, or whether or not, the pump directly causes muscle growth. With all that in mind, I have seen some wild shit done by lifters who chase the pump. I've seen some lifters go by feel when training, such as forgetting about progressive overload and ending sets far from failure. To be charitable, training by feel can work, if you're traveling for example. If you're truly pushing yourself close to failure every week, you should be automatically progressively overloading by doing more reps or adding weight. On the other hand, just chasing the pump can lead you astray. Hell, I get my best pump after like 2 sets in a given workout. Doing more than that doesn't really give me any more of a pump. If I chase the pump, I do 2 sets and I leave the gym. But that's in direct contradiction with what the direct evidence on volume says. If I want to maximize muscle growth, I should probably be doing at least 20 or more sets for a given muscle in a week. In a similar vein, the mind-muscle connection. By how heavily some YouTubers preach this, you'd think the science was rock solid. Well, it's not. We only have one study looking at the mind-muscle connection, measuring muscle growth, and in my view, it had mixed findings. While one muscle growth site favored focusing on the mind-muscle connection over focusing on performance of the movement, all other measurements favored focusing on performance of the movement. If you're currently pump chasing, or focusing on the mind-muscle connection, I have a few words for you, my brother in Christ. Seek help. And then I would urge you to look into what the studies directly comparing different volumes, frequencies, etc. have found are the optimal volume, frequency, intensity, etc. I do some cool videos on the topic. Similarly, for the time being, I would recommend focusing on external cues like get the weight up, or technical cues you find help your technique, over focusing excessively on the mind-muscle connection. Or are you confused by all the conflicting information on YouTube and other social media? Don't be. MyoAdapt will cut through all the noise and deliver you with a truly individualized training program that will maximize muscle growth. It works exactly like a coach does, but at a fraction of the price. It takes into consideration your preferences, your schedule, how much time you have to train each day, and gives you the best exercises for you, based on your training environment and much more. I'm confident in saying there is nothing else like it out there yet. MyoAdapt is a one-of-a-kind app. So go to myoadapt.com and put in your email to be notified when it launches. By signing up early, you'll be able to lock in a discount for a lifetime. Next, the claim that you need to train to failure to maximize muscle growth. You probably don't. In fact, I think people forget there's an inevitable compromise between volume and proximity to failure. An increase in either volume or proximity to failure likely leads to more muscle growth. However, increasing either of these will also increase fatigue, and recovery is a finite resource. Therefore, we have an opportunity cost. When we do more volume, we're making the trade-off of not training closer to failure. Fortunately, both higher volumes and training closer to failure do seem to yield more muscle growth. Don't believe me? Just look at the 2 latest published meta-analyses on these topics, by Basval and colleagues and by Robinson and colleagues. Both found greater muscle growth when training with more sets and or closer to failure. As a result, you probably don't need to train to failure to maximize muscle growth. You're probably able to maximize muscle growth by training shy of failure if you're willing to do higher volume, more sets to make up for it. Conversely, you can probably virtually maximize muscle growth by always training to failure, if you're willing to do slightly lower volumes to free up some recovery. If I can end this section with a bit of theory crafting, I think that always training to failure might be slightly worse for growth. There's very little evidence on this, but one recent study by Rafalo and colleagues suggests that going to failure too early into a workout can harm the effectiveness for the remainder of the workout. To wrap this up, if you like taking every set to failure, be my guest. You'll need to do less volume to free up some recovery resources, but it's possible. If you don't like training to failure, you don't need to. With the recovery resources you just freed up, simply increase how many sets you do per week to add stimulus for muscle growth. My personal favorite approach is taking the first set to about 2 to 3 reps from failure and the last set all the way to failure. As the last overrated YouTube trend, we have following Wolf coaching. Wait a second, who the fuck wrote the script? Following Wolf coaching? D tier? D tier? Oh, I will show you D tier, but what? As today's purveyor of the hot takes, I would like to hear what you have to say. Do you have objections about how I talked about high intensity training? Or do you object with anything else? Leave a comment down below and I'll respond to some of the most controversial and popular comments. See you next time.